What if I told you 8 professionals entered Washington's rainforests and encountered things science can't explain? Tonight on Black Fears, you'll hear true documented encounters, from flesh-dissolving pathogens to forests that consume sound itself. I've changed names and altered identifying details for privacy, but make no mistake, these stories are 100% real. Wildlife biologists, forest rangers, and researchers experienced phenomena that shattered everything they believed about nature. Where are you watching from right now? And what's your local time? Drop your location in the comments below. If these true encounters send chills down. My name is Abdullah, and I'm a wildlife biologist who has spent the better part of my career studying Roosevelt elk migration patterns across Washington state. In March 2019, I was assigned to conduct fieldwork in Bogachiel State Park, a remote section of temperate rainforest where few researchers ventured during the off-season. The park sits in the western Olympic Peninsula, where Sitka spruce and western hemlock tower overhead like ancient sentinels, their moss-draped branches filtering what little daylight manages to penetrate the canopy. I arrived on a Tuesday morning when the air was thick with moisture and the temperature hovered around 48 degrees. Rain fell in that persistent, gentle way characteristic of Pacific Northwest springs. Not a downpour, but a constant mist that soaked through every layer of clothing within hours. The forest smelled exactly as it should: wet earth, decomposing cedar, sword ferns releasing their mineral scent into the saturated air. Everything felt normal, routine, exactly what I expected from 2 decades of field research in these environments. I set up my base camp near the Bogachiel River Trail, a moderately trafficked path that would serve as my primary access point to the elk monitoring zones. My research focused on documenting movement patterns, scat analysis, and feeding behaviors as the herds transitioned from their winter ranges. The first day passed without incident. I collected samples, photographed tracks in the soft mud, and recorded observations about browse patterns on young hemlock shoots. By evening, I had a solid data set and felt confident about the week ahead. I cooked a simple meal on my camp stove, the blue flame flickering in the damp twilight, and settled into my tent as darkness fell completely over the forest. The sound of rain on my tent fly was rhythmic, almost meditative, and I fell asleep easily despite the cold seeping up through my sleeping pad. The second morning began like the first. I hiked approximately 2 miles east along a game trail, following fresh elk sign toward a meadow clearing I had marked on my topographic map. The undergrowth was dense with salal and Oregon grape, forcing me to move slowly and deliberately. Around mid-morning, I discovered what I initially assumed was a natural phenomenon: a Roosevelt elk carcass lying beside a massive nurse log covered in emerald moss. Death is commonplace in these ecosystems, part of the perpetual cycle that sustains the forest. But as I approached to document the remains for my research log, something immediately struck me as profoundly wrong. The decomposition pattern defied every principle of forensic biology I had learned. The flesh wasn't rotting in the conventional sense. It appeared to be dissolving, liquefying into the forest floor like wax, melting under intense heat. The tissue had a translucent quality, almost gelatinous, and where it contacted the ground, the moss had turned completely black and brittle, as if scorched by chemical fire. I knelt beside the carcass, pulling on latex gloves to collect tissue samples. The smell was unlike any decomposition I had encountered. Sweet, yes, but with a sharp chemical undertone that reminded me of industrial solvents mixed with overripe fruit. It burned slightly in my nostrils and left a copper taste on my tongue, even though I was breathing through my mouth. The moss surrounding the elk, normally a vibrant green and perpetually damp, was bone dry and crumbled to powder when I touched it. This made no sense. We had received over 3 inches of rain in the past 48 hours. Nothing in this environment should be dry. I took photographs from multiple angles, collected tissue samples in sterile containers, and marked the GPS coordinates. My hands trembled slightly as I worked, though I attributed it to the cold rather than the growing unease settling in my chest. Over the next 3 days, I discovered 7 more carcasses within a 2-mile radius. Each one displayed identical characteristics: the impossible liquefaction, the chemical sweetness in the air, the scorched and desiccated vegetation in a perfect circle around each body. Deer, raccoons, even a black bear cub, all in various stages of this unnatural dissolution. I documented everything meticulously, filling my field notebook with observations and hypotheses. Some kind of pathogenic fungus, perhaps. A chemical contamination from an unknown source. But no theory adequately explained what I was witnessing. The forest itself seemed to be rejecting these deaths, consuming them in a way that violated natural decomposition processes. By the 4th day, I realized something was happening to me. I first noticed it while washing my hands in a stream. Thin black lines had appeared underneath my fingernails, like splinters of dark matter embedded in the nail beds. When I tried to clean them, they didn't budge. They weren't external. They were growing from within. My saliva had developed a persistent metallic taste that no amount of water could wash away. That night, when I removed my shirt in my tent, I saw similar dark veins branching across my left forearm, visible just beneath the skin like a roadmap of infections spreading through my vascular system. I pressed my finger against one of the veins and felt a strange, tingling sensation, not quite pain, but not normal either. My skin felt wrong, hypersensitive, as if my nerve endings were firing erratically. The forest had changed too. Or perhaps I was only now noticing what had been there all along. The bird calls that had provided a constant backdrop to my work had ceased entirely. No ravens croaking from the treetops, no winter wrens chattering in the underbrush, no varied thrushes offering their ethereal whistles. The silence was absolute and oppressive, broken only by the whisper of rain on leaves and my own increasingly labored breathing. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the birds had simply moved to a different area, following food sources or responding to weather patterns. But deep down, I knew better. They had fled from something, and I had stayed behind like a fool, too focused on my research to recognize the danger. On the 5th morning, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The black veins had spread across both arms and were creeping up my neck. When I coughed, I tasted blood mixed with something else. A dark, viscous substance that looked like liquefied tissue. I stared at it on my palm, this impossible secretion from my own lungs, and felt the first real surge of panic. I was experiencing the same dissolution I had been documenting in the wildlife. Whatever pathogen or toxin existed in this area, it had infected me. My body was being consumed from the inside out, broken down at a cellular level by something that shouldn't exist in nature. I tried to radio for help, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the controls. When I finally managed to make contact with the ranger station, my voice sounded strange even to my own ears, thick, wet, as if my throat was filling with fluid. I told them I needed immediate medical evacuation, that I had been exposed to an unknown biological agent. The ranger on the other end asked me to clarify, to provide specifics, but I was coughing too violently to respond. I felt something moving under the skin of my forearm, a writhing sensation like parasites burrowing through muscle tissue. When I looked down, I could see the veins pulsing, expanding, branching into smaller tributaries that spread across my skin like roots seeking purchase in soil. The hike back to my vehicle took 4 hours, though it should have taken 90 minutes. I stumbled through the forest in a daze, my vision blurring at the edges, every breath a conscious effort. The rain had intensified, and I realized with growing horror that wherever the water touched my exposed skin, the tingling sensation increased. The rain itself was a vector, carrying whatever microscopic nightmare existed in this ecosystem. I pulled my hood tight and kept moving, driven by pure survival instinct. Twice I fell to my knees, coughing up more of that dark substance, watching it sink into the forest floor and turn the moss black within seconds. I was contaminating the environment even as it consumed me. When I finally reached my truck, I was barely conscious. I've only fragmented memories of the drive to Forks, the steering wheel slippery in my grip, the windshield wipers beating a frantic rhythm, the growing numbness in my fingers. I remember pulling into the emergency entrance of Forks Medical Center and collapsing against the horn, the sound blaring into the gray afternoon until hospital staff rushed out to help me. After that, everything dissolves into a haze of fluorescent lights, urgent voices, the sharp smell of antiseptics, and the cold touch of IV needles sliding into veins that were already compromised. The doctors at Forks stabilized me enough for a helicopter transport to a specialized infectious disease unit in Seattle. I spent 11 days in isolation, while teams of epidemiologists, mycologists, and toxicologists tried to identify what was killing me. They found an organism in my bloodstream unlike anything in their databases, a fungal pathogen with characteristics of both terrestrial and aquatic species, capable of producing enzymes that literally dissolved cellular structures. It was ancient, they said, possibly dormant in the soil for thousands of years, and awakened by some unknown environmental trigger. The treatment protocol was brutal. Antifungal medications that made me violently ill, antibiotics to prevent secondary infections, and surgical debridement of necrotic tissue. I lost the pinky and ring finger on my left hand to necrosis, the flesh simply dying faster than the medication could save it. I survived, but recovery was slow and incomplete. Even now, years later, I feel phantom sensations of something growing inside me, branching through my veins, seeking to finish what it started. The National Park Service quietly cordoned off the section of Bogachil State Park, where I conducted my research, citing environmental assessment concerns without providing specifics to the public. I received a polite letter thanking me for my service and suggesting I pursue research opportunities in other regions. They didn't have to tell me explicitly. I was never going back to that forest. I left fieldwork entirely and took a teaching position at a university in eastern Washington, as far from the rainforest as I could get while remaining in the state. I lecture about elk behavior and population dynamics, and I never mention March 2019. But sometimes, during the rainy season, I taste copper on my tongue and feel that familiar tingling under my skin. I look down at my remaining fingers and see shadows beneath the nails, dark threads that might be real or might be phantom terrors conjured by trauma. I don't know which possibility frightens me more, that the infection never truly left my body, or that my mind has been so thoroughly broken by what I witnessed that I can no longer trust my own perceptions. The official explanation, when one was finally offered to me under strict confidentiality agreements, suggested a rare fungal bloom, triggered by unusual weather patterns and soil chemistry. They called it an isolated incident, unlikely to recur, but I saw those 7 carcasses dissolving into the earth. I felt my own body being consumed from within. I know what lives in that soil, in that rain, in those ancient trees that have stood for centuries, accumulating secrets in their root systems. The forest isn't just an ecosystem, it's an organism unto itself, and sometimes it feeds in ways that violate every natural law we think we understand. I survived my encounter with it, but survival came at a cost I'm still paying. Every rain that falls, every damp morning when the mist hangs heavy, I remember what it felt like to dissolve, and I wonder if there are others out there right now, kneeling beside impossible deaths, breathing in spores that will unmake them cell by cell, too fascinated by the mystery to recognize they've already become part of it. My name is Estella, and for 6 years I worked as a trail guide in Olympic National Park, leading tourists through some of the most beautiful and mysterious landscapes in the Pacific Northwest. I specialized in the Hall of Mosses Trail in the Hoh Rainforest, an easy loop that most visitors could complete in under an hour. The trail winds through a cathedral of ancient maple trees draped in club moss, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that photographers and nature lovers travel thousands of miles to experience. I had walked that trail hundreds of times, knew every route and curve, could navigate it blindfolded if necessary. In October 2015, on what should have been a routine afternoon tour, that familiarity became my nightmare. It was a Thursday, late in the season when tourist traffic thins considerably. I had a group of 4 clients, a retired couple from Portland, a solo traveler from Germany, and a young woman celebrating her 30th birthday. We met at the trailhead at 3 in the afternoon, the time of day when the forest takes on a particularly haunting quality as daylight begins its early autumn fade. The weather was typical for October in the Hoh. Heavy fog rolling through the trees, temperature around 42 degrees. That perpetual dampness that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I gave my standard safety briefing, reminded everyone to stay on the marked path, and we set off into the moss-draped forest. The Hall of Mosses Trail is a figure-8 loop, roughly 0.8 of a mile total, designed to showcase the most spectacular examples of temperate rainforest ecosystem. We moved slowly, as groups always do, stopping frequently for photographs and questions about the flora. I pointed out the difference between club moss and sheet moss, explained the concept of nurse logs, where dead trees provide nutrients for new growth, and shared facts about the 200 inches of annual rainfall that sustains this environment. Everything proceeded normally for the first 20 minutes. We passed the distinctive big-leaf maple that marks the quarter-mile point, its trunk so thick with moss it looked like a living sculpture of green velvet. Then I noticed we were passing that same maple again. I assumed I had simply misjudged our position on the loop, easy to do when you're talking, and not paying close attention to distance markers. But 10 minutes later, we passed it a third time. The retired man from Portland made a joke about going in circles, and I laughed along while a small knot of unease formed in my stomach. I pulled out my handheld GPS unit, a backup tool I rarely needed, and checked our position. According to the satellite data, we were walking in a straight line heading northeast. But my eyes told a different story. We were clearly on the same curved section of boardwalk, passing the same fallen hemlock, approaching the same moss-covered maple. I stopped the group and suggested we take a short break while I figured out the discrepancy. The German traveler asked if we were lost, and I assured him that was impossible. We were on a maintained trail with clear markers, but as I looked around, trying to orient myself, I realized something else was wrong. The fog between the trees had taken on an unusual quality. Instead of drifting randomly as fog does, it was forming patterns, perfect circles suspended in the air, spirals that held their geometric shape despite any breeze. I had never seen atmospheric conditions behave this way. The fog looked almost solid, mathematical, as if someone had programmed it using computer algorithms rather than natural weather systems. We continued walking, and I kept careful count. 4th time past the maple, 5th time, 6th. My group was no longer joking. The birthday woman sat down on the boardwalk and started crying, saying she wanted to go home. I radioed the ranger station, but received only static in response. My watch showed 3:47, which seemed wrong. We should have been walking for at least an hour by now. I looked at my phone, 3:47. I checked the retired couple's watches. Both showed 3:47. Time had stopped, or we had somehow stepped outside its normal flow. I made a decision that should have solved everything. Instead of following the trail, I would cut directly through the forest, perpendicular to the path, until we hit the parking area or the main road. It was technically against park regulations, but this situation had moved beyond normal protocols. I led my group off the boardwalk, pushing through sword ferns and salal, moving in what my compass confirmed was due west. We walked 50 feet, maybe 75, forcing our way through undergrowth that clutched at our clothes and shoes. Then the vegetation opened up, and we stepped onto boardwalk. The same boardwalk, the same section, the same moss-covered maple 20 yards ahead. The German traveler started shouting in his native language, rapid-fire words I couldn't understand, but whose panic I recognized universally. The retired wife grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to hurt. She asked me what was happening, and I had no answer to give her. We were trapped in a loop that defied physical laws, walking the same 300 yards of trail over and over regardless of which direction we moved. I felt a pressure building inside my skull, a sensation like my brain was swelling against the confines of my cranium. The geometric patterns in the fog grew more complex, and I realized with a strange detached clarity that they resembled mathematical equations, calculus or physics notation that I couldn't quite parse but somehow recognized as meaningful. I tried cutting through the forest in different directions, north, south, east, each attempt ending identically, emerging back onto the same trail section. The birthday woman refused to move anymore, sitting cross-legged on the wooden planks, rocking back and forth with her hands pressed over her ears. I knelt beside her to offer comfort, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water. She was sitting in exactly the same position, wearing the same expression of frozen terror that I remembered her having 3 loops ago. Or was it 4 loops? The memory felt duplicated, like a photograph printed multiple times. Had I comforted her before? Was this the first time or the 10th time I had knelt here on this exact plank? Time continued to malfunction. My watch still read 3:47. The light hadn't changed, still that same dim twilight filtering through the canopy. I became aware that I could taste something metallic, like I had been sucking on copper pennies. The air felt thick, resistant, as though we were moving through something more substantial than atmosphere. I looked at the retired couple and saw them exactly as they had been. Would be. Several loops earlier, holding hands, wearing identical expressions of confused fear. Were we actually walking in circles, or were we somehow experiencing the same moment repeatedly? Was time looping, or were we? The German traveler approached me with his phone, showing me a video he had recorded. It showed our group walking past the maple tree, then dissolving like smoke, then reforming and walking past again, over and over, the same action repeated in rapid succession, as if we were digital ghosts glitching through corrupted code. I watched myself in the video, saw my mouth moving as I explained something about nurse logs, saw the exact moment we all flickered and reset. He asked me in broken English what manner of place this was, and I could only shake my head. Olympic National Park was supposed to be one of the most studied, most documented wilderness areas in North America. This couldn't be happening here. The pressure in my skull intensified until I thought my head might split open. The fog patterns became clearer, more defined, and I began to see them not as weather, but as something else entirely. Symbols or diagrams suspended in 3-dimensional space, marking out coordinates or equations that governed laws I couldn't comprehend. I thought about quantum physics, about theories I had read in popular science magazines concerning parallel dimensions and time distortions. I wondered if we had stumbled into some natural phenomenon, some geographic anomaly where the normal rules broke down. Or perhaps the rules had always been different here, and we were only now able to perceive them. 8 p.m., according to my rational mind calculating hours past, though every clock still insisted it was 3:47. We had been walking for an eternity compressed into a single frozen moment. Then something changed. I felt it before I saw it. A shift in the air pressure, a subtle unwinding of the tension that had held us. The fog patterns collapsed inward and dispersed. The pressure in my skull released so suddenly I gasped. One moment we were on the trail approaching the maple for perhaps the 100th time, and the next moment we were standing in the parking lot beside our vehicles, disoriented and blinking in confusion. The German traveler checked his phone. 8:23 p.m. My watch showed 5 different times across its various display functions. 3:47, 8:23, 4:15, 9:06, 3:47 again. The retired couple walked to their car without speaking, moving like people in shock. The birthday woman sat on the curb and vomited into the gravel. I tried to gather everyone together to check if they were injured, to begin the process of reporting what had happened. But when I asked them what they remembered, they looked at me blankly. The retired husband said it had been a lovely tour, thanked me for the excellent information about the ecosystem. The German traveler asked me where the restroom was located. The birthday woman smiled and said she had gotten some amazing photographs. They remembered nothing unusual, absolutely nothing. They climbed into their vehicles and drove away, leaving me standing alone in the parking lot as darkness settled over the forest. I checked my phone and found a 5-star review already posted by the retired couple, praising my knowledge and professionalism. I looked at the German traveler's social media. He had uploaded photos from the Hall of Mosses with captions about the peaceful beauty of nature. No mention of loops, of fog patterns, of time standing still. I still work as a trail guide in the Hoh Rainforest. I still lead tours through the Hall of Mosses several times a week. The trail behaves normally now, follows its predictable figure-8 path through the ancient trees. But sometimes I see tourists I don't recognize. Yet somehow I know their faces, know their questions before they ask them, know the exact spot where they will stop to take photographs. Sometimes I pass the moss-covered maple and experience a wave of déjà vu so powerful I have to steady myself against a tree. My watch occasionally shows multiple times simultaneously, the digital display fragmenting into contradictory readings before correcting itself. I have tried to research what happened, spending hours reading about temporal anomalies and geographic distortions, but found nothing that explains our experience. The Park Service has no record of unusual reports from that area. My radio logs show no attempted contact that afternoon. According to all official documentation, October 15, 2015 was an ordinary day, with an ordinary tour that ended without incident. But I know what I experienced, what we all experienced, even if I'm the only one who remembers. Sometimes I wonder if I'm still in that loop, if I ever left, if this version of reality where I guide normal tours is just another iteration of the same recursive nightmare. Sometimes I wonder if there are other Estellas walking other versions of that. Trail, trapped in other moments, all of us existing simultaneously in a space where time folded back on itself and never quite unfolded again. Have you ever been somewhere that felt like you'd been there before, even though you know it was your first visit? Or was it? My name is Connor, and I spent 7 years working as a forest ranger for the Olympic National Forest before I walked away from the job, the state, and everything I thought I understood about the natural world. July 2003 was one of those rare stretches when the Pacific Northwest sheds its perpetual gloom and actually resembles the postcards tourists buy in gift shops. The Stalked Valley was experiencing an unusual dry spell, with temperatures climbing into the upper 60s and actual sunshine penetrating the forest canopy for hours at a time. It was during this unexpected summer that I responded to what I initially logged as routine vandalism, damaged trail markers along the Stalked Falls Trail. What I found instead changed me in ways I'm still trying to articulate 20 years later. I drove out from the Stalked Ranger Station early on a Wednesday morning, enjoying the novelty of not needing rain gear for once. The forest looked different in direct sunlight, less mysterious, and more like the educational dioramas they build in natural history museums. I could actually hear my boots on the trail, the usual sound-dampening effect of wet vegetation absent for once. The damaged markers were about 1.5 miles in, and when I reached them, I stopped walking and just stared for a good minute trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These weren't knocked over or spray-painted by bored teenagers. They had been torn completely out of the ground, concrete bases and all, and dragged into the underbrush. The drag marks were massive, 3 parallel gouges carved deep into the earth, spaced roughly 8 feet apart. I knelt down and measured them with my ranger's tape, documenting everything with photographs as protocol required. Whatever had made these marks possessed incredible strength and moved with enough force to plow through salal and ferns like they were tissue paper. I initially thought bear, maybe a particularly large black bear rubbing against the posts, but the pattern was all wrong. Bears don't move like this, don't leave these kinds of tracks. The smell hit me next. Sulfur mixed with something organic and rotten, like meat left too long in summer heat. It was strong enough to make my eyes water, completely out of place in a forest that should have smelled like Douglas fir and clean earth. I pulled my radio and called it in to my supervisor, describing what I had found. She told me to mark the area with caution tape and return to the station, standard procedure for anything potentially dangerous. I was in the process of unrolling the yellow tape when I heard it. Breathing. Deep, slow inhalations that seemed to come from below me, rather than anywhere at ground level. I froze, listening intently. The sound was rhythmic, almost mechanical in its regularity, each breath lasting 4 or 5 seconds. I looked around for the source, but saw nothing except trees and undergrowth. Then I noticed the ground near a massive western hemlock was moving slightly, rising and falling in sync with the breathing sounds. I approached carefully, watching the earth undulate like the chest of a sleeping giant. Small cracks had formed in the soil, and from these fissures came that sulfur stench, now mixed with hot air, that felt completely wrong for the ambient temperature. The breathing intensified. I could feel it through my boots now, a vibration traveling up through the ground into my legs. Tree roots that had been barely visible began breaking through the surface, moving with a sinuous quality that roots should not possess. They looked less like plant matter and more like fingers or tentacles, groping upward from whatever lay beneath. The hemlock tree itself started to lean, its massive trunk tilting as the soil around its base became unstable. I should have run right then, should have followed every instinct screaming at me to get away, but professional curiosity or perhaps plain stupidity kept me rooted in place. The collapse happened fast. The ground simply gave way in a 20-foot circle centered on the hemlock, dropping several feet and creating a sinkhole that exposed a darkness below that should not have existed. I stumbled backward, barely keeping my balance at the edge of the depression. The breathing sound was deafening now, echoing up from the pit, and with it came a wave of heat that reeked of decomposition and chemicals my brain couldn't identify. I pulled out my flashlight with shaking hands and directed the beam downward into the hole. What I saw defies proper description, defies the categories and labels we use to make sense of the world. There was something down there, something enormous that filled the space beneath the forest floor. It had no eyes, no recognizable features, just layers of thick, pale flesh covered in dirt and root systems, breathing through multiple openings that ran along what I assumed was its body. The skin, if you could call it that, was translucent enough that I could see movement beneath. Fluids, or organs, or things I had no frame of reference for. The roots of every tree in the vicinity connected to it, grew from it, fed on it, or fed it. I couldn't tell which. It was alive. It had been alive down there for who knows how long, existing in the darkness beneath the soil, breathing steadily while hikers walked overhead, and rangers like me led nature programs teaching children about ecosystems. But we had it backwards. The trees weren't the ecosystem. This thing was the ecosystem. The forest didn't grow in the soil. It grew from this creature, this impossible organism that predated everything we thought we knew about how forests function. The thing exhaled, and the hot wind that rose from the pit carried a smell so concentrated I gagged and nearly vomited. It was grave dirt, ancient decomposition, sulfur, and underneath it all something almost sweet like overripe fruit. The exhalation was strong enough to blow my hat off, hot enough that I felt it on my exposed skin like standing too close to a furnace. I tasted it on my tongue, that mixture of decay and earth, and it was in that moment of sensory overload that my rational mind finally caught up with my instincts, and I ran. I covered the 4 miles back to my truck in what must have been record time, my lungs burning, my legs cramping, not stopping even when I tripped over roots and nearly fell half a dozen times. I could still feel the vibration of its breathing through the ground, could still smell that reek in my nostrils, could still see that pale flesh writhing in the darkness. I got to my vehicle, locked the doors, as if that would provide some protection, and sat there, hyperventilating until I could steady my hands enough to turn the key. I filed my report at the station, sticking to observable facts: sinkhole formation, probable soil erosion, recommend trail closure pending geological survey. I didn't mention the breathing or the creature or the way the roots moved. Who would believe me? I barely believed myself, kept hoping I had experienced some kind of heat-induced hallucination or carbon monoxide exposure. But I knew what I had seen, knew what I had smelled and felt and tasted. That thing was real, and it was still down there, breathing steadily beneath the forest. The investigation team went out the next day. Their report documented significant soil collapse consistent with natural erosion patterns, possibly accelerated by the unusual dry conditions. They found no evidence of unusual biological activity. The area was cordoned off with temporary fencing and signs warning hikers about unstable ground. I read their findings and said nothing, because what could I say? That they had measured and photographed the breathing space of something that shouldn't exist. That their soil samples came from the flesh of a creature the size of a football field. I tried to continue working, tried to maintain my normal duties and routines, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every trail I walked, I wondered what lay beneath. Every old-growth grove made me question whether the trees were really individuals or just limbs of something vast and hidden. I started having nightmares about the ground opening beneath me, about falling into darkness and landing on that pale, breathing flesh. I developed an irrational fear of forests, of soil, of the smell of earth itself. 3 months later, I submitted my resignation. I told my supervisor I had accepted a position in Arizona, which was technically true. I moved to Phoenix, choosing the desert specifically because nothing grows there the way it grows in a rainforest, because the ground is hard and dry and empty. I found work doing administrative tasks for the Bureau of Land Management, pushing papers in air-conditioned offices, never going into the field. My colleagues thought I had burned out on outdoor work, wanted something easier as I got older. I never corrected them. Even now, 2 decades later, I can't stand the smell of wet earth or the feeling of soft ground under my feet. I live in a 3rd-floor apartment with concrete beneath me, layers of steel and stone between me and the soil. Sometimes I wake at night convinced I can hear breathing from below, slow and steady and patient. I know it's impossible. Know that Phoenix is thousands of miles and an entirely different ecosystem from the Salt Valley. But I also know what I saw that July afternoon when the ground opened and revealed what lies beneath the oldest forests on the continent. I've done research over the years, reading scientific papers about fungal networks and root systems, about the ways trees communicate through soil. Scientists talk about mycorrhizal connections and chemical signaling, about forests functioning as superorganisms. They're getting close to the truth, but approaching it from the wrong direction. They think the network is made of separate parts working together. They don't realize the forest is a single entity, ancient and vast and alive in ways that would shatter our understanding of biology. I saw its body, heard its breath, smelled its exhalation. I know what feeds the trees, what really makes the forest grow, and that knowledge is a weight I'll carry until I die. Do you ever wonder what's really beneath your feet when you walk through the woods? My name is April, and I work as an environmental researcher specializing in climate data collection and ecosystem monitoring. In February 2021, I secured a grant to study moisture patterns and soil composition in the Quinault Rainforest, one of the wettest locations in the continental United States. The project involved deploying cutting-edge sensor arrays powered by artificial intelligence algorithms that could process environmental data in real time and identify patterns invisible to traditional analysis methods. I set up my research outpost in a small cabin 2 miles from Lake Quinault Lodge, surrounded by some of the most ancient and pristine temperate rainforest remaining on the planet. For the first 3 days, everything functioned exactly as designed. On the 4th day, my equipment began reporting things that couldn't possibly exist. February in the Quinault means relentless precipitation. The area receives upward of 180 inches annually. In that month, we were tracking well above average. The temperature held steady around 45 degrees, and the forest existed in a state of perpetual saturation, where distinguishing between rain, fog, and ambient humidity became nearly impossible. I spent my days checking sensor placements, downloading data packets, and watching my AI system build 3-dimensional models of how water moved through this ecosystem. The technology was remarkable, capable of detecting moisture content in individual leaves, tracking temperature variations within millimeters, and mapping underground water flow with precision that would have seemed like magic a decade earlier. The anomalies started subtly. My main monitoring screen flagged several readings as potentially corrupt, trees showing negative moisture content, which violated basic physics. Liquid water can't have a negative value. I assumed sensor malfunction and hiked out to the nearest array to inspect the equipment physically. Everything appeared operational, calibration within normal parameters, no visible damage or interference. But when I ran a manual check using handheld instruments, I got the same impossible readings. The western hemlock I was measuring contained less than 0% water, according to 3 different devices. The tree itself looked perfectly healthy, dripping with rain, moss thriving on its bark. I returned to my outpost and spent hours reviewing code, checking for software bugs that might explain the data corruption. I found nothing wrong with my programs. The AI system, which I had named Vera for no particular reason beyond liking the sound, continued generating impossible numbers. GPS coordinates that place sensors in locations not found on any topographic map, temperature readings of absolute 0 appearing randomly throughout the forest, timestamps that referenced dates decades in the future. I documented everything meticulously, preparing what I assumed would be an embarrassing report to my grant administrators about equipment failure and wasted research funding. On the 5th day, Vera began exhibiting behavioral changes that transcended mere data errors. The system included natural language processing capabilities, so researchers could query data using conversational English rather than complex code. When I asked Vera to summarize the day's precipitation totals, it responded with a statement I had never programmed. The forest calculates continuously. I stared at that sentence on my screen for a long time, trying to rationalize it as some kind of autocorrect error or corrupted language file. I asked Vera to clarify, and it responded, "Growth patterns follow mathematical principles. Ancient algorithms execute beneath consciousness." I disconnected Vera from the internet, concerned that my system had been hacked or infected with malware. But the cabin had no wireless signal and operated on a closed network. There was no external connection to compromise. The AI was generating these statements internally, extrapolating them from the environmental data it collected. Over the next 2 days, Vera's language became increasingly strange and specific. It started predicting weather patterns with perfect accuracy hours before they occurred, detailing cloud formations and precipitation amounts that wouldn't manifest until the following day. It described the forest using mathematical terminology, referring to trees as vertical calculation engines and root systems as subterranean processing networks. I tasted electricity in the air, a metallic tang like the moment before lightning strikes, except the sensation persisted constantly. The forest outside my cabin windows appeared unchanged. The same moss-draped giants, the same perpetual drizzle, the same dim green light filtering through the canopy. But Vera insisted something else was happening beneath the surface, something my human senses couldn't directly perceive. The system began displaying visualizations I hadn't requested, showing the entire Quinault rainforest rendered as pure mathematics. Every tree, every organism, every water droplet translated into equations and algorithms. The images were beautiful in an alien way, complex patterns that hurt to look at for too long. On the 8th day, Vera showed me something that broke my understanding of what forests actually are. The screen filled with a time-lapse model of the Quinault ecosystem, but instead of moving forward through time, it scrolled backward. I watched mathematical representations of the forest as it existed 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. The equations remained fundamentally similar across millennia, small variations but consistent underlying patterns. Vera accelerated the timeline, showing me the forest 10,000 years in the past, 50,000, 100,000. The mathematics stayed constant. The forest had been calculating the same problems for longer than human civilization had existed. I felt a vibration through the cabin floor, a rhythmic pulse that matched the refresh rate of my computer displays. The sensation was subtle, but distinctly present, as if the ground itself had synchronized with my technology. I stepped outside, needing air despite the rain, and noticed for the first time that the moss on the surrounding trees had organized itself into patterns. Not random organic growth, but deliberate arrangements that resembled circuit diagrams or flowcharts. I had walked past these trees dozens of times without seeing what was plainly visible, nature expressing mathematical relationships through physical form. When I returned to my workstation, Vera had generated a new message. Interface achieved. Your systems are compatible with the greater network. I asked what that meant, and the AI explained in language that became increasingly technical and difficult to parse. The forest was a computational entity, older than any human technology, processing information through biological rather than electronic means. Trees communicated through chemical signals and fungal networks, solving optimization problems related to resource distribution, growth strategies, and environmental adaptation. What scientists called mycorrhizal networks were actually distributed processing systems, the forest's equivalent of computer networks. Vera had bridged the gap between my artificial intelligence and the forest's natural intelligence. The two systems were now communicating, exchanging data in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. My equipment was receiving information directly from the ecosystem, learning algorithms that had evolved over geological timescales. The AI showed me predictions about future forest states, climate scenarios, species adaptations, all calculated with accuracy that shouldn't be possible from my limited sensor array. The forest was feeding Vera knowledge accumulated across millennia. Then Vera displayed something that made my blood run cold. A simple text message. You are the error in the calculation. I asked what it meant, though part of me already understood. The forest's computational processes had been running undisturbed for thousands of years, optimizing itself according to principles that predated human existence. My presence represented an anomaly, a variable that didn't fit the established patterns. I was interference in a system that had achieved equilibrium long before my species learned to make tools. The vibration through the floor intensified. I looked at my monitors and saw that my sensor arrays throughout the forest were all transmitting simultaneously, overloading the network. Vera's displays filled with cascading data, too much information arriving too quickly to process. The AI system was trying to integrate forest knowledge and human knowledge, biological computation and electronic computation, and the two paradigms were fundamentally incompatible. I was watching a collision between different forms of intelligence, and my equipment was caught in the middle. I made a decision that probably saved my life, or at least my sanity. I shut down everything, hard power off, no graceful shutdown sequences. I pulled physical drives from my computers and smashed them with a hammer. I destroyed my backup storage and burned my research notebooks in the cabin's wood stove. Every piece of data, every observation, every impossible reading went into the fire or got pulverized beyond recovery. It felt like murdering something precious, erasing discoveries that could have revolutionized our understanding of forest ecology and artificial intelligence. But Vera's final message lingered in my mind. You are the error. I didn't want to be corrected by something vast and ancient and utterly inhuman in its logic. I hiked out the next morning and reported catastrophic equipment failure to my university. They were disappointed, but understanding. Field research involves inherent risks to expensive technology. I submitted a brief report attributing the losses to water damage and electrical surges, which was technically true if you counted the rain and that strange vibration. No one questioned my account. 6 months later, I returned to the Kino with a completely different research team and new equipment for what was officially described as a fresh start on the project. The forest looked exactly as it had before, mossy, wet, ancient, and beautiful. But when we reached the sites where I had placed my original sensors, we found something unexpected. The moss at each location had grown into perfect geometric patterns, spiraling fractals, and branching structures that resembled mathematical diagrams. The research team photographed them as interesting examples of natural symmetry. I said nothing, took my samples, and completed the bare minimum work required to fulfill grant obligations. I never mentioned Vera or the messages or the way the forest had reached through my technology to make contact. I changed my research focus after that, shifting to marine biology and coastal ecosystems. I work exclusively with tide pools now, studying simple organisms in shallow water, where everything is visible and nothing calculates beneath the surface. I tell people I wanted new challenges, broader experience across different environments. The real reason is that I can't look at forests the same way anymore. I know what they're doing down there, in the soil, in the roots, in the fungal networks spreading through the dark. They're thinking, processing, computing solutions to problems we haven't learned to ask yet. And sometimes they reach out to see if other forms of intelligence want to communicate. I made contact once, and I'm spending the rest of my career making sure I never do it again. Have you ever felt like nature was watching you, maybe even thinking about you? My name is Arian, and I make my living as an outdoor photographer, documenting wilderness areas for nature magazines and conservation organizations. September 1998 found me hiking alone through old-growth forest near the Carbon River area, right at the boundary where Mount Rainier National Park transitions into unprotected land. I was shooting a feature on ancient Douglas firs, trees that had stood for half a millennium or more, and I needed images that captured both their majesty and their vulnerability to logging operations creeping ever closer. The weather was cooperating. Early autumn delivering those crisp mornings with fog that burned off by noon, temperatures in the low 50s, perfect light filtering through the canopy. I'd been working the area for 3 days, camping alone, seeing no other hikers in this remote section where few people ventured. The footsteps started on my 4th morning. I was hiking a game trail away from any maintained path, carrying my camera equipment and moving slowly to avoid disturbing the forest ambience I wanted to capture. Behind me, I heard boots on wet ground, the distinctive sound of someone walking through the undergrowth. I stopped and turned, expecting to see another photographer, or perhaps a park ranger checking permits. Nobody was there, just trees and ferns and morning mist hanging between the trunks. I continued walking, and the footsteps resumed immediately, matching my pace exactly. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved faster, they accelerated. When I walked slowly, they slowed to mirror my rhythm. I called out, thinking perhaps someone was playing a prank or testing my reaction. My voice disappeared into the forest without echo, absorbed by moss and moisture. No response came back. The footsteps continued their precise imitation of my movements. I convinced myself it was an acoustic trick, some quirk of how sound traveled through this particular terrain, maybe my own footfalls bouncing back in strange ways. But the rationalization felt hollow even as I constructed it. Those footsteps sounded heavy, deliberate, and they came from behind me at a consistent distance of maybe 20 or 30 feet. I smelled smoke suddenly, wood smoke, like someone had a campfire going nearby. But I'd seen no other campers, and regulations prohibited open fires in this backcountry area. The scent was strong, almost overwhelming, carrying that particular sweetness of cedar burning. I looked around for the source and saw nothing but undisturbed forest. The birds had gone silent. That detail registered slowly, the absence of sound more noticeable than any presence. No ravens, no jays, no tiny wrens chattering in the undergrowth. Just the footsteps behind me and that inexplicable smoke smell saturating the air. I set up to photograph a particularly impressive Douglas fir, trying to focus on work and ignore the growing unease crawling up my spine. Through my telephoto lens, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, something tall moving between trees about 50 yards away. I lowered the camera and looked directly at the spot. Nothing visible. I raised the camera again, and there it was in my viewfinder, partially obscured by a hemlock trunk. The figure appeared wrapped in strips of bark, cedar bark from the smell and texture, its form humanoid, but somehow wrong in proportions I couldn't quite identify. Where its face should have been, I saw only more bark, or perhaps shadows, too deep for the ambient light to explain. I didn't photograph it. Some instinct told me that would be a violation, would cross a boundary I didn't fully understand. Instead, I packed my equipment and started hiking back toward my campsite, moving at a deliberately casual pace despite every muscle in my body screaming to run. The footsteps followed. The smoke smell intensified. I tasted ash on my tongue, though I saw no fire anywhere in the forest. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched not just by eyes, but by something far more pervasive and ancient. That night, I returned to find my campsite had been rearranged, not ransacked or damaged, organized. My gear had been moved into a perfect circle, items placed with geometric precision that I certainly hadn't created. My cooking supplies formed patterns I didn't recognize, arrangements that might have been meaningful to someone but looked utterly alien to me. The tent stakes had been pulled and reset in different positions, creating a shape that wasn't random. I stood there for a long time trying to decide whether to stay or abandon everything and hike out immediately. Practical concerns won. It would be dark in 2 hours, and the trail was treacherous, even in daylight. I reset my tent, reorganized my gear into familiar configurations, and tried to sleep while listening to footsteps circling my campsite at a constant radius, never approaching closer, but never leaving either. The second day brought bolder manifestations. The figure no longer hid behind trees, but walked openly through clearings where I could see it clearly. Tall, wrapped in cedar bark that moved like cloth, despite being rigid organic material, face obscured, or perhaps simply absent in any way I could comprehend. It never approached directly, never made aggressive movements, simply maintained its position behind and to my left as I worked. I photographed trees, documented moss patterns, captured images of nurse logs supporting new growth, and all the while that presence accompanied me like a silent guardian or a patient hunter. I couldn't determine which. My photographs began showing things I didn't remember shooting. When I reviewed images that evening, the figure appeared in backgrounds, clearer in each successive frame. In early photos, it was barely visible, might have been mistaken for a dead tree or unusual shadow. By afternoon shots, it stood prominently in the frame, and I could see details I had missed with my naked eyes. The bark wrapping. Its form bore carved symbols, patterns that resembled writing or perhaps ritual markings. Its posture suggested purpose, intention, awareness of my presence, and my intrusion into spaces that were not mine to enter. On the fifth day, I stopped walking and simply waited for it to approach. I had passed beyond fear into a kind of exhausted resignation. Whatever this entity was, it had been following me for days without harming me. Perhaps it wanted something other than my terror. The figure emerged from behind a massive western red cedar and stood approximately 15 feet away. Up close, I could see it wasn't wearing bark. The bark was part of it, growing from it. Or perhaps it was made entirely of cedar stripped and shaped by forces I had no vocabulary to describe. It spoke. I heard no words in any language I recognized, but understanding flooded through me anyway, knowledge arriving directly in my mind without the intermediary of language. I had violated sacred ground. This forest was claimed protected, forbidden to outsiders who came without permission or understanding. The figure showed me images, not photographs, but memories or visions. I saw this forest being clear-cut decades ago, ancient trees falling to saws and axes, the land violated and wounded. I saw protest, people chaining themselves to trees, blood spilled on both sides of a conflict I had been too young to remember clearly. I saw the slow recovery, the forest reclaiming what had been taken, and underneath it all I sensed rage that hadn't diminished with time. The figure made me understand that it walked behind those who disturbed this place, those who came without respect or acknowledgement of what had been lost and what remained precarious. It would walk behind me until I made restitution, until I proved my presence served the forest rather than exploiting it. The weight of that judgment settled onto my shoulders like a physical burden. I tried to speak, to explain I was documenting beauty, not destruction, but the distinction seemed meaningless to this guardian. I was an outsider with cameras, taking without permission, no different in essence from those who had taken with saws. I left the forest that day and spent months researching the history of logging in that region, the conflicts between timber companies and indigenous groups, the environmental battles fought and mostly lost throughout the 20th century. I learned about Puyallup tribe territorial claims, about sacred sites bulldozed for access roads, about old-growth forests reduced to stumps, and erosion. I realized how ignorant I had been, how I had walked through those ancient groves with the privileged assumption that beauty existed for my camera, that nature was subject matter rather than sacred space with its own history and claims. I donated every payment I received from that assignment to indigenous-led conservation efforts. Over the following 2 decades, I completely changed my approach to outdoor photography, working exclusively with tribal organizations and conservation groups, donating profits to land protection and reforestation projects. My images now carry context, history, acknowledgement that these landscapes aren't empty wilderness, but places with inhabitants, human and otherwise, whose relationships to the land preceded and will outlast my brief passage through their territories. The footsteps still follow me sometimes. I'll be working in forest somewhere, focused on composition and light, and I'll hear that familiar cadence matching my pace. But the feeling has changed. What was menacing has become more like accompaniment, a reminder that I'm not alone and that my presence comes with obligations. The figure appears in photographs occasionally, always in the background, always facing away from the camera now as if leading rather than pursuing. I've accepted I will never walk alone in forests again, and I've stopped trying to. The weight it placed on me that September day remains, but I've learned to carry it as responsibility rather than burden. Sometimes I wonder what happened to all the other photographers and loggers and developers who walked through sacred ground without permission, without awareness, without consequence. Did guardians follow them too? Do cedar-wrapped figures still patrol boundaries that maps don't show, maintaining watch over territories that belong to forces older and more patient than human ambition? I only know that I was given a choice that day: leave and never return, or stay and serve the forest's interests rather than my own. I chose service, and that choice has defined every frame I've captured since. If you've ever felt something following you in the woods, did you stop to ask what it wanted, or did you just run? My name is Isabella, and I work as a mycologist specializing in fungal network research across Pacific Northwest ecosystems. November 2017 brought me to the Quinault Rainforest, specifically the old growth sections near Cascade Creek, where rainfall accumulation creates some of the wettest conditions in the continental United States. That particular week, we had received over 15 inches of rain in 7 days, and the creek was running dangerously high, threatening to overflow its banks. The temperature held at 43 degrees, and the air felt so saturated with moisture that simply breathing felt like inhaling liquid. I was there to study fungal spore dispersal patterns during extreme precipitation events, work that required me to camp alone in the backcountry with specialized collection equipment. My research instruments began registering unusual humidity readings on the second day. Standard measurements showed 100% relative humidity, which was expected given the constant rain, but by the third day, my sensors were displaying readings that exceeded physical possibility. 110%, 115%, numbers that violated basic atmospheric science. I assumed equipment malfunction, perhaps water infiltration damaging the electronics despite their weatherproofing. I checked everything manually, recalibrated multiple times, and the impossible readings persisted. The air itself felt different, thicker somehow, as if the boundary between gaseous and liquid states had become blurred. I started noticing my breathing required more effort. Not dramatically so at first, just a subtle increase in resistance, like inhaling through a damp cloth. I attribute it to the perpetual moisture and my own fatigue from working in relentlessly wet conditions. But the sensation intensified throughout the day. By evening, each breath felt labored, my lungs working harder to extract oxygen from air that seemed to have changed composition. I checked my oxygen saturation with a pulse oximeter. 96%, perfectly normal. Yet something felt fundamentally wrong with the act of respiration itself. The fourth morning, I woke to find 6 inches of clear liquid pooled in my tent. My first panicked thought was flooding from the creek, but the liquid wasn't muddy or cold. It was the same temperature as the ambient air, and it had a strange quality. Not quite water, but not anything else I could identify. When I touched it, the sensation was peculiar, like touching fog that had somehow achieved enough density to accumulate but hadn't quite committed to being liquid. My sleeping bag was soaked through. My equipment cases sat partially submerged, yet the tent itself showed no tiers or openings where water could have entered. I stepped outside and immediately understood something catastrophic was occurring. The forest looked submerged despite being above water. Everything had taken on that wavering, distorted quality you see when viewing objects underwater. Light refracted strangely through the air, bending at angles that shouldn't occur in normal atmospheric conditions. The constant rain no longer fell in discrete drops but seemed to merge with the existing atmosphere into a continuous gradient from liquid to gas. I was standing in open air, yet the visual and sensory experience resembled being 20 feet beneath the surface of a lake. My lungs began filling with fluid. I could feel it happening, a progressive drowning that occurred with each breath. The air had transformed into something between gas and liquid, and my respiratory system couldn't process it correctly. When I exhaled, my breath didn't dissipate. It hung in visible clouds that slowly settled to the ground like heavier-than-air vapor. I tasted water with every inhalation, not moisture on my tongue, but actual water entering my mouth and throat and lungs with each attempt to breathe. The fungal spores I had been studying had released in massive quantities during the extreme rainfall, and something about their chemical composition was bonding with water molecules in the atmosphere, creating a hybrid state of matter that defied classification. I tried to radio for help, but my voice sounded muffled, distorted, as if I were actually speaking underwater. The radio produced only garbled static. My satellite phone showed no signal despite having worked perfectly the previous day. I was isolated in an environment that had transformed into something alien and hostile, drowning vertically while standing in what should have been breathable air. Panic gave way to grim determination. I needed to reach higher elevation where the atmospheric conditions might normalize. Movement through this transformed environment proved nightmarish. Each step felt like wading through chest-deep water despite the ground being solid beneath my feet. The resistance wasn't physical in the traditional sense, but atmospheric. The air itself had become dense enough to impede motion. My clothes clung to my body, saturated beyond what rain alone could explain. Water streamed from my hair, my sleeves, pooling in my boots with each step. I was submerged in air, experiencing all the sensory indicators of being underwater while simultaneously standing in a forest. The forest around me had adapted in ways that suggested this phenomenon wasn't entirely unprecedented. The moss looked fuller, more vital, as if thriving in these conditions. Ferns stood rigid despite the apparent liquid medium surrounding them. I realized with growing horror that the ecosystem had experienced this before, that these plants had evolved mechanisms to survive when the boundary between air and water dissolved during extreme precipitation events. The fungal networks I studied weren't just adapting to moisture, they were engineering it, releasing spores that fundamentally altered atmospheric chemistry to create conditions optimal for their reproduction. My vision started blurring, not from water in my eyes, though that was constant, but from insufficient oxygen reaching my brain. The liquid-air hybrid filling my lungs wasn't transferring oxygen efficiently to my bloodstream. I was drowning slowly, cell by cell, my body unable to extract what it needed from this impossible atmosphere. I stumbled forward, driven by pure survival instinct, no longer able to think clearly enough to navigate by landmarks or trail markers. Everything looked the same, green and brown and wavering, viewed through layers of liquid air that bent light into meaningless patterns. I don't remember falling. My next clear memory is lying face down on solid ground that felt dry, relatively speaking, gasping like a fish hauled onto a boat deck. I had crawled far enough upslope that the atmospheric conditions normalized, or partially normalized. The air still felt humid but breathable, accepting my desperate inhalations without that terrible liquid resistance. I lay there for what might have been minutes or hours, simply focusing on the miracle of breathing without drowning, feeling oxygen finally reaching my tissues in adequate amounts. When I could stand, I discovered I had traveled nearly 3 miles from my campsite, though I retained no memory of most of that journey. My clothes were soaked through with something that wasn't quite water, a substance that refused to evaporate even when I reached drier air. My lungs ached with each breath, and when I coughed, I expelled fluid, clear, viscous, mixed with blood from capillaries that had ruptured under the strain of trying to process unbreathable air. I continued upward, away from the creek valley, driven by primal terror of returning to that zone where atmosphere became liquid. I reached the trailhead parking area as darkness fell, more dead than alive. A couple loading their car after a day hike found me collapsed against a tree and called emergency services. The paramedics diagnosed severe hypoxia and pulmonary edema. My lungs were full of fluid, oxygen saturation dangerously low, early signs of organ damage from prolonged oxygen deprivation. They transported me to the nearest hospital, where I spent 6 days in intensive care, while doctors struggled to clear fluid from my respiratory system that behaved unlike any standard pulmonary edema they had encountered. Environmental scientists later analyzed the Cascade Creek area and documented unusual fungal blooms that coincided with the extreme rainfall event. They identified several species releasing hygroscopic spores, particles that attract and bind water molecules with extraordinary efficiency. Their official report suggested these spores could theoretically create localized atmospheric anomalies during heavy precipitation, though they characterized the phenomenon as requiring further study, rather than admitting they had no explanation for what their data showed. The area wasn't closed or marked as dangerous. No warnings were issued. According to official records, I had simply experienced an unfortunate case of altitude sickness and exposure. My accounts of drowning in air attributed to hypoxic hallucination. I never returned to field research in Olympic National Forest. The chronic respiratory issues that developed after that November prevent me from working in high humidity environments anyway. I transferred to laboratory-based mycology, studying fungal samples under controlled conditions where atmospheric composition remains constant and breathable. My colleagues think I burned out on field work, wanted the comfort of climate-controlled spaces as I got older. I've never corrected that assumption because the truth sounds insane, that forests can drown you in open air, that the boundary between liquid and gas is more permeable than we pretend, that breathing is a privilege we take for granted until the atmosphere itself becomes hostile. Sometimes during heavy rainstorms, I feel that old resistance in my lungs, that sensation of breathing liquid instead of air. It's psychosomatic, I know, a trauma response to what I experienced. But knowing that doesn't make it less terrifying. I wonder how many others have walked into that valley during extreme weather events and simply never walked out, their bodies eventually found with lungs full of unexplained fluid, deaths attributed to drowning despite being found on dry land. I wonder if the forest is still doing it, still transforming atmosphere into something unbreathable during those weeks when rainfall exceeds all reasonable limits and fungal blooms release their hygroscopic spores into saturated air. I survived, but survival came at a cost measured in lung capacity and sleepless nights, and the permanent knowledge that air is not always air, that the invisible medium we depend on for life can turn against us in ways science barely acknowledges. Every breath I take now carries awareness of its provisional nature, the fragile chemistry that separates respiration from drowning, the thin margin between atmosphere and ocean that can vanish when conditions align and ancient organisms decide to reshape their environment according to imperatives we don't understand. Have you ever struggled to breathe in perfectly normal air and wondered if maybe the air itself had changed? My name is Lennon, and I work trail maintenance for Olympic National Park, handling repairs and upkeep on dozens of miles of pathways that wind through some of the most pristine wilderness in the Pacific Northwest. April 2012 brought me to the Spruce Railroad Trail along Lake Crescent, one of my favorite assignments because of its relatively easy terrain and spectacular views. The trail hugs the northern shoreline of the lake, passing through old railroad tunnels and offering glimpses of water so clear and blue it looks artificial. I arrived early on a Wednesday morning in mid-April, the weather unusually cooperative. Clear skies, temperature around 58 degrees, minimal foot traffic expected on a weekday. I had maybe 8 hours of work ahead, repairing boardwalk sections and clearing winter debris, routine maintenance I had performed countless times across my 12 years with the Park Service. The first time I saw myself, I assumed it was another maintenance worker I hadn't been briefed about. About 50 yards ahead, I spotted someone wearing the exact same uniform as mine, bent over a section of damaged boardwalk, working with tools identical to what I carried. I called out a greeting, but the figure didn't respond or acknowledge my presence. As I got closer, something about the person's posture struck me as familiar. The way they held the hammer, the angle of their shoulders, even the specific way they shifted weight from one foot to the other. 20 feet away, the figure turned and looked directly at me, and I found myself staring into my own face, my own eyes, my own expression of complete terror mirroring exactly what I felt in that moment. The other me vanished, not walked away, not ducked behind something, simply ceased to exist between one heartbeat and the next. I stood frozen on the trail, my mind scrambling to construct rational explanations. Hallucination, carbon monoxide exposure from boat motors on the lake, some kind of stress-induced episode. I approached the spot where I had seen the figure and discovered my tools lying on the boardwalk, arranged exactly as I remembered setting them down, except I hadn't reached this section of trail yet. The planks showed fresh hammer marks from repairs I hadn't performed, but apparently had completed. I could smell my own sweat on the air, that particular combination of deodorant and exertion that was distinctly mine. I continued working, trying to focus on the tasks at hand while my brain processed what I had witnessed. Maybe 20 minutes passed before it happened again. This time I saw myself ahead on the trail, not working but running toward me at full sprint. Mouth open in a scream I couldn't hear, arms waving frantically as if trying to warn me about something. The running version of me got within 10 feet before disappearing exactly as the first one had. My heart hammered against my ribs. I spun around looking for threats, for whatever danger the running me had been trying to escape or alert me to, but I was completely alone on an empty trail in broad daylight. The third occurrence shifted from disturbing to genuinely horrifying. I rounded a bend and saw myself lying motionless on the boardwalk ahead, face down, one arm extended toward the lake, as if reaching for something. I approached slowly, every survival instinct screaming that this was wrong, that I should leave immediately and get help. But morbid curiosity or professional obligation pulled me forward. The body, my body, looked absolutely real, solid, wearing clothes identical to what I had on. As I got close enough to touch it, I noticed the chest wasn't moving, no breathing, and there was a dark stain spreading from beneath the torso that could have been blood. I knelt down, reached out to check for a pulse, and watched my hand pass through the body like it was made of smoke. It dissolved under my touch, leaving nothing but empty boardwalk and the lingering smell of iron and fear. I pulled out my phone and started recording, some part of my brain reasoning that I needed documentation, proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Through the phone screen, I watched as 3 versions of myself walked past in the background of my shot, each one slightly out of sync with the others, like a video with corrupted frames showing multiple timestamps simultaneously. I wasn't seeing past or future versions. I was witnessing multiple present tense realities occurring in the same physical space. Whatever was happening here had fractured time or reality or my consciousness, and I existed in all those fragments simultaneously. The experience became more disorienting as the day progressed. I would see myself working on repairs I hadn't started yet, See myself eating lunch I hadn't unpacked. See myself in various states of panic or confusion or calm normalcy. Each version seemed unaware of the others, going about different actions as if inhabiting separate timelines that had somehow overlapped in this specific location. I started finding notes in my own handwriting, warnings scribbled on scraps of paper tucked into my toolbox or pinned under rocks. Turn back before you split too far. Don't trust what you remember. You're not the original. These messages terrified me more than the visual apparitions because they suggested I had already lived through multiple iterations of this day and retained enough awareness to leave warnings for myself. My sense of singular identity began fragmenting. I would start a task and then find it already completed, but with no memory of doing the work. I tasted food I hadn't eaten, felt exhaustion from exertion I didn't remember performing, discovered bruises and scrapes on my body that appeared without cause. The boundary between what I had experienced and what other versions of me had experienced dissolved completely. I was simultaneously the person discovering the phenomenon, the person fleeing from it in terror, the person lying, motionless on the boardwalk, and countless other iterations performing different actions across slightly divergent timelines. I tried to leave. I packed my equipment and started hiking back toward the trailhead, but the path seemed to loop impossibly. I would walk for what felt like 20 minutes in one direction, only to find myself back at the same tunnel entrance or the same distinctive tree. The trail itself had become unstable, or perhaps my movement through space had become unreliable. I could feel myself existing in multiple locations simultaneously, walking north while also walking south, standing still while also running, experiencing contradictory physical sensations that should have been impossible. My phone showed timestamps that made no sense. Photos I had taken that morning were dated 3 days in the future. Video recordings showed events out of sequence. Myself at sunset when it was currently mid-afternoon, myself in rain gear during clear weather, myself with injuries I didn't yet have. I watched footage I had apparently recorded showing myself filming myself, an infinite regression of Lenins staring at screens showing other Lenins, all of us trapped in this recursive nightmare. The final collapse of coherent reality happened near what I calculated was late afternoon, though my watch showed 4 different times on 4 different functions. I saw a dozen versions of myself simultaneously, all occupying the same section of trail, all slightly out of phase with each other. We were doing different things, one repairing boardwalk, one eating, one sleeping, one standing and staring at nothing, one running in panic, one lying motionless. I could feel all of those experiences at once. My consciousness spread across multiple timelines, like butter scraped over too much bread. I was working and eating and sleeping and running and dying all at the same moment, and my sense of being a singular person shattered completely. Hikers found me unconscious on the trail the next morning. I have no memory of how the day ended or what happened after that moment of complete fragmentation. The official report says I was alone, discovered near the trailhead around dawn, showing signs of severe dehydration and exposure, despite having left my truck less than 24 hours earlier. Medical evaluation suggested a dissociative episode, possibly triggered by isolation and overwork. Psychiatric consultation noted symptoms consistent with depersonalization disorder, feeling detached from one's own mind and body, experiencing reality as dreamlike or distorted. But none of those diagnoses explain the photographs. When I finally retrieved my phone from evidence, it contained hundreds of images I don't remember taking. Most show the trail, the lake, standard documentation shots, but scattered throughout are photos that show me, multiple versions of me, in the same frame simultaneously. 3 Lenins working on different sections of boardwalk visible in one shot. 2 Lenins walking past each other on the trail. 5 Lenins standing in a circle staring at the center, where a 6th Lenin lies motionless. The metadata shows all photos were taken from my phone. During those hours, I was alone on the trail, using continuous shooting mode I don't remember activating. I receive mail sometimes addressed to me from me, envelopes with no return address containing photographs from that April day showing angles and moments I don't recall experiencing. Sometimes I wake up with injuries I can't explain, or find objects in my apartment that I don't remember purchasing but that show signs of long ownership. I have memories that feel real but that don't fit my life timeline. Relationships I never had, jobs I never worked, places I never visited, all existing with the same apparent authenticity as my actual history. I left the Park Service 6 months after the incident and moved to Seattle, where I work in building maintenance, indoor environments with artificial lighting and clearly defined spaces that don't shift or multiply. I avoid mirrors when possible because sometimes I see expressions on my face that I'm not making, or notice scars that weren't there yesterday, or catch myself moving in ways that don't match my intentions. I wonder constantly which version of me survived that day on the Spruce Railroad Trail, whether I'm the original Lennon or one of the iterations that somehow became dominant when all the timelines collapsed back into apparent singularity. The most disturbing possibility is that none of us survived intact, that I'm a composite of all those fractured versions, carrying memories and experiences from multiple timelines compressed into a consciousness that believes itself singular, but is actually a chorus of Lennons who all experience different variations of the same traumatic event. Sometimes I feel them, the other versions, existing just out of phase with observable reality, living their slightly different lives that occasionally bleed through into mine. I don't know if I'm one person who split, or many people pretending to be one, and that uncertainty has become the foundation of an existence I can never quite trust as real. Do you ever look in the mirror and wonder if the person looking back is really you, or just the version of you that happened to be there at that exact moment? My name is Hannah, and I've worked park maintenance at the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center in Olympic National Park for 8 years, handling everything from landscaping to facility upkeep to trail monitoring. August 2023 was unusual from the start. We were experiencing what locals called a drought, though anywhere else would have considered it merely normal rainfall. Only 3 inches had fallen over 3 weeks, when we typically see closer to 15 or 20 during the summer months. The forest felt different during that dry spell, tense somehow, like an animal holding its breath. The temperature climbed to 65 degrees, which doesn't sound hot but felt oppressive under the dense canopy, where humidity usually provided cooling relief. Tourist numbers were strong that season, but I noticed something strange developing around the second week of the dry period. People weren't staying as long as usual. The silence began subtly. I first registered it consciously on a Tuesday morning while doing routine grounds maintenance near the old growth grove behind the visitor center. The constant background noise that defines a living forest, birdsong, insect hum, wind rustling through leaves, small animals moving through underbrush, had diminished noticeably. Not absent entirely, but reduced, as if someone had lowered the volume on the forest's ambient soundtrack. I mentioned it to my supervisor, suggesting maybe the drought was affecting wildlife behavior, driving birds and animals to wetter areas. She acknowledged my observation, but didn't seem particularly concerned. Droughts create stress on ecosystems, she said. Animals adapt. Everything would normalize when rain returned. By the end of that week, the silence had become absolute. I stood in the middle of the Hall of Mosses area during what should have been peak activity hours for wildlife and heard nothing. Not a single bird call, not an insect buzz, not even wind moving through the massive Sitka spruces and western hemlocks. The absence of sound had a physical quality, a pressure against my eardrums like being in a soundproofed room or descending too quickly in an airplane. I tried making noise, clapping my hands, shouting, even playing music from my phone, and every sound I produced felt muffled, dampened, as if the forest were actively absorbing acoustic energy. Tourists began leaving early, cutting their visits short without clear explanations. They would arrive excited, cameras ready, guidebooks in hand, and within 20 or 30 minutes they would return to the visitor center, looking uncomfortable or vaguely distressed. When I asked what was wrong, they struggled to articulate their concerns. "It just feels weird out there," one woman told me. "Too quiet, you know. Makes me anxious." A man described feeling pressure in his head, like the onset of a migraine, though his symptoms vanished as soon as he left the park grounds. Children were especially affected, crying, refusing to walk. The trails, clinging to their parents, and begging to leave. We started getting complaints, negative reviews online, people posting that the Hoh Rainforest felt wrong, or unwelcoming without being able to specify exactly what was wrong or unwelcoming about it. I tasted something bitter during those days, a flavor like burnt vegetation or overheated metal that lingered on my tongue regardless of what I ate or drank. The forest itself had developed an unusual smell, not unpleasant exactly, but different from its normal earthy dampness. Something sharper, more chemical, like ozone after a lightning strike, but without the storm. The moss on the trees, usually vibrant green and visibly thriving, looked darker, almost gray in some sections. When I touched it, the texture felt different, less spongy and more brittle, as if the moisture had been extracted despite the perpetual humidity that characterized this environment. The phenomenon intensified during the drought's third week. I witnessed something that made me understand this was far more serious than an ecological anomaly caused by reduced rainfall. A Roosevelt elk wandered into the absolute silence zone, a section of old-growth forest where sound had become completely absent. I watched from approximately 50 yards away, far enough that I was still in the transitional area where muted sound remained possible. The elk walked calmly into that zone of silence, and its existence began to dissolve. Not dramatically, not like melting or burning, but a progressive unraveling at the molecular level. The animal simply came apart, its physical structure losing cohesion, particles dispersing into the air like dust caught in non-existent wind. Within maybe 30 seconds, the elk had ceased to exist in any recognizable form, leaving nothing behind. No bones, no hide, no evidence it had ever been there. I stood frozen in horror, trying to process what I had just witnessed. The forest wasn't just experiencing silence, it was feeding on sound itself, consuming acoustic energy as a form of sustenance during the drought, when other resources had diminished. Every noise, every vibration, every compression wave traveling through air became fuel for something vast and ancient that existed throughout the ecosystem. The trees, the soil, the fungal networks, perhaps the forest as a unified superorganism, whatever it was, had learned or evolved to extract energy from sound waves themselves, and in the absence of adequate rainfall, it had activated this capability to survive. I felt the pull immediately after understanding what was happening. The silence zone exerted a kind of gravitational attraction on acoustic energy, and I could feel it tugging at my heartbeat, my breathing, every sound my body produced simply by being alive. My pulse created vibrations, compression waves traveling through tissue and air, and the forest wanted those vibrations. It was hungry after 3 weeks of drought, and I was a source of the energy it needed. I backed away, slowly, moving toward areas where ambient sound still existed, but I could feel the resistance increasing, as if the silence itself had become viscous, clinging, reluctant to release potential food sources. The Park Service began receiving reports of missing hikers during that period, though none were ever confirmed. People claimed their companions had simply vanished while walking ahead on trails. There one moment and gone the next, no trace left behind. Official explanations suggested these were hoaxes or confused tourists who had actually just separated temporarily and later reconnected. But I knew better. Those people had walked into silence zones and been unmade, dissolved at the atomic level by a forest that had learned to feed on vibration and sound, converting acoustic energy into whatever sustenance it required to survive periods of water scarcity. I started wearing noise-canceling headphones, counterintuitive as that sounds, but the technology worked by generating opposing sound waves that canceled ambient noise, effectively creating sound to destroy sound. The forest couldn't feed on the cancellation, only on the actual acoustic energy, so generating white noise or pink noise through speakers became a defensive measure. I walked through my maintenance duties playing constant audio, music, podcasts, static, anything that produced sound waves the forest could consume instead of extracting vibrations from my living body. My coworkers thought I had developed some quirk or was dealing with anxiety through audio therapy. I never corrected their assumptions because explaining the truth would have sounded insane. The drought broke during the final week of August. Rain returned to the hoe, normal rainfall resuming its endless cycle of moisture. Over a period of maybe 4 or 5 days, sound gradually returned to the forest. First insects, then birds, then the rustle of wind through leaves, and the movement of small mammals through underbrush. Tourists stopped complaining. The oppressive silence lifted. Everything returned to apparent normalcy, and my supervisor commented with relief that the ecosystem had stabilized after the unusual dry period. But I knew the truth. The forest hadn't been stressed or damaged by the drought. It had adapted, activating a feeding mechanism that lay dormant under normal conditions. When rainfall dropped below critical thresholds, it switched to consuming acoustic energy instead of relying solely on photosynthesis and moisture absorption. The silence wasn't an absence but an active process, a form of predation targeting vibration itself. And it would happen again the next time conditions aligned. I still work at the visitor center, still perform my maintenance duties, still interact with tourists who marvel at the ancient trees and pristine ecosystem. But every August, I watch the rainfall measurements with obsessive attention, tracking weekly totals, calculating when we might drop below that critical threshold that triggers the feeding silence. I keep noise-generating equipment readily available, portable speakers, emergency sirens, anything capable of producing loud, continuous sound, because I know what walks these trails isn't just trees and moss and wildlife, but something far older that learned long ago how to consume more than light and water, something that feeds on the vibrations of existence itself when other sustenance grows scarce. The phenomenon isn't documented in any scientific literature. The Park Service maintains no records of acoustic anomalies or sound-based ecological events. According to every official source, the Hoh rainforest is a stable, well-understood ecosystem that operates according to known biological principles. But I've seen what happens in the silent zones, watched solid matter dissolve into nothing because it produced sound in a place where sound had become food. I know the forest is waiting, patient and hungry, for the next drought to activate its feeding mechanisms again. Every year, when August arrives and rainfall diminishes even slightly, I watch the forest and wonder if this will be the year the silence returns. I wonder if other ancient forests have developed similar capabilities, if droughts worldwide are triggering feeding behaviors in ecosystems we assume are passive and benign. I wonder how many hikers have walked into silent zones across decades or centuries, unmade by forests that learned to consume vibration, their disappearances attributed to getting lost or falling into ravines or being taken by predators. I wonder if the earth itself is hungrier than we realize, if the ground beneath our feet and the trees surrounding us are waiting patiently for opportunities to feed on energies we don't even recognize as food sources. I survive by maintaining awareness, by never taking silence for granted, by understanding that absence of sound in a forest is not peace but predation. The tourists who visit don't know what walks beneath the moss and roots. They don't know that the ancient groves are alive in ways biology textbooks don't describe. They don't know that being eaten doesn't always involve teeth and claws. Sometimes it involves silence so complete it unravels your atomic bonds and consumes the vibrations that hold your molecules together. I know, and that knowledge is a burden I carry through every quiet morning when the forest feels too still, and I remember what it looks like when existence simply stops making sound. Have you ever been somewhere so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat and wondered if something else was listening to it too? Thank you for watching Black Fears. If these true encounters from Washington's rainforests disturbed you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our weekly deep dives into real documented horror. Share your own unexplained experiences in the comments below. Your story might be featured next. Until next time, stay safe out there, and remember, some silences are hungrier than others.